Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Microsoft Today. It is January 8th, 2019. Today we kind of have a special episode that morphed from just a small segment into a whole show. We're going to talk about the history of Microsoft and their acquisitions. But first, a short message from our sponsors. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? When I was trying to get this podcast off the ground, I had a few questions. How do I record an episode? How do I get my show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other places people like to listen? How do I make money from my podcast? The answer to every one of these questions is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing your podcast. Best of all, it's 100% free. And now, Anchor can match you with great sponsors too, so you can get paid to podcast. Seriously, if you've ever thought about starting a podcast, now's the time to do it. Anchor makes it that easy. I've had an idea for this podcast for years, and I've finally just gotten around to doing it, and I regret not getting started earlier. So don't be that guy. Don't be like me. So if you've always wanted to start a podcast and make money doing it, go to anchor.fm/start to join me and the diverse community of podcasters already using Anchor. That's anchor.fm/start. I can't wait to hear your podcast. Welcome back to Microsoft Today and our second official week as a podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. I can't really say much other than the fact that I'm extremely happy with how the podcast has been so far and the reception you guys out there have given us. We truly couldn't have asked for a better reception from the community as a whole, which tells me that the path we're taking with this podcast is highly desired. People want a different type of technology podcast. Everybody has tech news. Everybody discusses the hot and trending topics and those sorts of things, but nobody really gets underneath the surface and gets to the root of what technology is doing to our society and how technology is improving, maybe and even sometimes hindering our lives. So that's going to be the goal for this podcast going forward. We hope it continues to grow. Want to let you guys know that whenever I launched this podcast last Tuesday, just a week ago, it was literally on one platform. Now it's on 10 platforms, and we're still not in two of the three biggest platforms, which includes iTunes and TuneIn Radio. Those, along with CastBox, are our three that still remain, and we're going to be in those as soon as possible. We'll eventually try to make it to iHeartRadio as well, but it's going to take some time for that. And the same thing goes for getting into Pandora's beta of their podcast platform. We are happy to say that we're going to try to be wherever you guys want to listen. We have a YouTube channel where we upload the podcast. We have a Facebook channel where we upload the podcast. It's on all the hosting channels we've discussed, Google Podcasts and other podcast platforms. If you're a fan of Medium, we launched our Medium blog today where we're also uploading each episode utilizing our YouTube feed. We're doing this because we love it. The sponsorships are not going to make us rich. They're not going to get us big. They're hopefully going to cover some of the costs. We will be moving to a much better podcast hosting solution that is a little pricey, but I figured if we want to take this podcast seriously, I'm going to go with a serious podcast solution that has enterprise level type support. And I've made that decision because of the overwhelming reception that the Microsoft enthusiast and Microsoft professional community has given me. I would have never thought that we would have reached well over 1,000 people within the first week without even being on all of the major podcast platforms. We just hit Google Podcasts today. So as a thanks from myself to you, I've decided to make this transition from a more entry-level podcast platform like Anchor. As you heard within the sponsor segment, I do endorse, and I would never put my name on something I don't endorse. It is a great platform for the entry-level type podcast. If you have reservations about starting a podcast, but you want to start one, I highly recommend downloading the Anchor app and just start recording, because I wish I have done so many years ago. And I may not have even started on this podcast if it wasn't so easy to get started with Anchor, because I probably would have procrastinated even longer. Thank you to Anchor, but I have a larger vision for this podcast and I think their support can provide. And so we're going to go ahead and make that transition early so it is easier than doing so down the line. So over the coming weeks, we may change the RSS feed a little bit, but we should be able to migrate without you losing anything, but just keep that in mind. If you ever have any issues finding the podcast, just head to twitter.com/MSFT today, and we always have the RSS links and then the links to the other social networks also on there as well. With that said, I also want to mention, again, the Patreon. We do have commercial-free and upcoming exclusive video content coming to our Patreon, so patreon.com/MSFT today. If you haven't listened to the first episode of this podcast from last week, the January 1st episode, I highly recommend you listening to it if you're interested in supporting the podcast, because I go in depth about the vision of this podcast and what we want to accomplish with the podcast, and I say we because this is larger than me, and I also outline all of our... Finally, I want to say that the website is not quite complete yet. I know I'd promised to try to get it in last weekend. I went to the Houston Texans game instead and saw my team lose really, really badly. So I decided to take the weekend off of my sorrow. But I did work on it some, It is very, very close, so it'll definitely launch within the next 3 to 4 days. Thank you again for your patience with that, but if you have any questions, you can hit us up on twitter.com/MSFT today, Instagram, Facebook. All of our social links are /MSFT today. Enough of that. Sorry, we just keep growing. I know we're adding more and more people every week, so people haven't heard all of our details, so I'd like to just get out of the way to start. So this episode's kind of special because I had planned on just making this a segment within a podcast, but then it just grew from there because Microsoft has been doing a lot in this space recently. So I thought it deserved a further look and a further examination before we move forward. The reason I'd plan to bring up acquisitions is because I've opened a dialogue with some people from one of their acquired companies to talk about their products and maybe have them on the podcast. So that led me down the rabbit hole of investigating all of their recent acquisitions and maybe even looking at their acquisition history so we could just discuss and build upon the topics that we discussed last week about Microsoft empowering everyone, especially developers and IT professionals, for adapting for the future. So that's the introduction and the background. Now we get down to the nitty gritty, because this is how we do it. You're darn right, this is how we do it, Montel, on MSFT today. Kind of like last week when we were trying to get an understanding of where Microsoft is going, I think it's important to look at where they've been and especially the acquisitions they've made throughout their years so we can hopefully paint a picture to where they're going. I think their acquisitions are clear indicators into their market strategy and their strategy as a business as a whole. So we're going to start out by taking a look at their major acquisitions throughout their history, starting back to the early days of the 80s. We'll move forward to the last couple of years, which show a clear indicator to what we talked about last week being their priorities, which is automation, AI, and empowering people through their platforms. You can't talk about Microsoft acquisitions without acknowledging the most influential and important acquisition of their history, but also one of the most influential and important acquisitions in modern history. 20th century history, technological history, and that is MS-DOS. DOS wasn't an acquisition in the traditional sense, but it was an acquisition of intellectual property. In 1980, after not being able to reach a license agreement with a competitor, IBM tasked Microsoft with developing and/or licensing an operating system for their upcoming IBM 5150 personal computer. IBM had already tasked Microsoft with creating the basic programming language for the PC, but they also added on the additional task of finding an operating system for said PC. Instead of developing DOS themselves, Microsoft was able to acquire QDOS, or Quick and Dirty Operating System, from a small software company called Seattle Computer Products. QDOS was developed in just 7 weeks by Tim Paterson, and upon its completion was renamed to 86DOS. The technology and the rights to 86DOS was purchased by Microsoft for $75,000 in July of 1981. And Microsoft simply renamed version 1.10 of 86DOS to MS-DOS 1.10. Just a few short months later, in November of 1981, IBM licensed and began distributing PC-DOS, a branded version of MS-DOS, across their entire IBM PC line. IBM continued to license MS-DOS until 1991. By which time, Microsoft was a software juggernaut. And while Microsoft was a software company and they were developing the basic language for IBM, if they had not acquired 86DOS and rebranded it as MS-DOS, which they licensed to IBM, who branded it PC-DOS, they may not be the juggernaut that we know today. We have no idea where they would be now, but we have to think that they would not have had the meteoric rise within the late 80s and early 90s that they did. And Bill Gates wouldn't have become the quote-unquote rock star, jumping over chairs in Connie Chung interviews. With that said, I think we can call it that the $75,000 investment for MS-DOS is easily the best acquisition that Microsoft has ever made, but they've certainly made great acquisitions since then. So that leads us to a list of historic acquisitions and kind of an overview of each one of those and how they've transformed the company. We'll start in 1987 when they acquired Forethought. Forethought had a little-known presentation program that would later become Microsoft PowerPoint. So think about that. Had they not made the acquisition of Forethought in 1987, would PowerPoint be what it is today? I don't think so. I don't think that they'd be the leader in presentation software and have been since day one. Everybody's been chasing Microsoft since that moment with presentation software. That just goes to show that early acquisitions can help build a brand even better and better and better. Microsoft knocked it out of the park with Forethought and PowerPoint. Through the lead up to Windows 95, Microsoft was pretty quiet on the acquisition front from a major acquisition perspective. The next major acquisition that they had was Hotmail. I don't know if you guys remember Hotmail. I still use Hotmail. It's my everyday mail. I've had it since before Microsoft owned it, actually, my Hotmail email address, and I've never given it up. It's still kicking to this day. But they acquired Hotmail in 1997 to add to their MSN.com initiative as they were rolling out Windows XP. I don't know if many of you remember, but in the early days of Windows XP with Windows Passport and Live.com, you could actually register an MSN.com email address as well. Hotmail was the platform that they utilized to get people into that ecosystem and to tie into Passport, which eventually became Live.com, which also became MSN.com, which is also now Outlook.com. Hotmail.com, which was a huge platform in its own right before the Microsoft acquisition, was even more so once Microsoft acquired them. And Microsoft grew that platform to what it is today with Outlook.com. They've been growing and developing that product for over 20 years now, which is quite astounding. So you have to even think back, where we are with now Office 365. We know Exchange Server was going to come along, but how long would it have taken Microsoft to get involved in the consumer and or web email space? Web, consumer, and business are all kind of cross-platform. You know what I mean? They're cross-system now. It's all the web-based now. It's all in the cloud. But back in the day, there was a clear segregation between personal email, work email, internal email servers, external email servers, and the like. And had Microsoft not acquired Hotmail, who knows how long it would have taken them to catch up in that personal email space. Would Yahoo still have been the major one? Gmail came in much, much later. There was Yahoo and AOL and Excite.com, I think. You had very limited choice when it came to decent, free online email in the mid to late 90s, and Hotmail was one of those. And it's definitely a highlight of acquisitions for the company. And I think it's kind of fun to look back and kind of imagine where they wouldn't be without making that acquisition. I don't know if the Microsoft of today is the Microsoft of today without the Hotmail acquisition. I just don't think that it would be. I think it's a fun exercise to play. And this is Microsoft today, after all. So fast forward from 1997 to the year 2000, when Microsoft acquired Visio Corporation, which you all know was later rebranded to Microsoft Visio. For those that may not know, Visio is a very popular diagramming program. I was an engineer's assistant in 1997, and I was doing Visio diagrams before Microsoft actually owned Visio. I was doing process flow diagrams for my engineers using Visio straight out of high school. So it's kind of cool to see Microsoft take this product that I had used before and acquire it and start bundling it with Office to the business world. And Visio is still going strong to this day. It's still the industry leader in diagramming and process flows and things of that nature. There are some web apps and things like that have made up ground in that area, but Visio is still the industry leader. And not only that, Microsoft has also started extending Visio to other parts of the Office ecosystem, including Microsoft Flow. So you can actually design your Microsoft flows within Visio. You've been able to do this in the past with process flows from SharePoint, but you can actually physically design the flows for Microsoft Flow if you utilize the Visio Plus Office 365 subscription, which I think is $15 a month or something like that. But Visio is still extremely powerful to this day, and it's very important to their Office ecosystem. All right, so we're in the year 2000, and we're going to head to 2002, and at which time Microsoft purchased Navision for their ERP technology, which is Enterprise Resource Planning, for anyone who may not know. And whenever they acquired Navision, they also spun up Microsoft Business Solutions, which was a fancy new division within the company. Navision has since been renamed, rebranded, and improved, and now you would know it as Microsoft Dynamics. Microsoft Dynamics is a massive ecosystem, so I won't even try to describe it. Just take my word for it, it's a major cash cow for the company and a major point of emphasis for the company as well. From 2002, we're going to fast forward to 2007 and 2008, at which time Microsoft got tired of Google owning search, and more specifically, the ad revenue one can make from search. Microsoft acquired Aquantive and its subsidiaries, which included Avenue A and Razorfish, were highly, highly coveted within Silicon Valley. That was followed quickly by other acquisitions with Fast Search and Transfer. And if you think, Bing didn't come around until 2009. So before that, there was Live.com and MSN.com, and that was where most searches were done. Believe it or not, MSN.com is still one of the most highly trafficked sites in the world. They still make a ton of money from search. Without those acquisitions, I don't think Bing launches in 2009 to compete with Yahoo and Google and eat a little bit into Google, but mostly they took over from Yahoo and other search engines that were flailing. But without those acquisitions in 2007 and 2008, they probably wouldn't be able to stay profitable within the ad revenue and online search division without them. After 2008, we head to 2011, and that's whenever they acquired Skype. At the time of its acquisition, Skype was the premier VoIP and internet chat program in the world. It's since died a little bit since then because of the mobile apps, but it's still extremely popular, and it's a popular brand to them. Whenever they acquired Skype, they spun up a new division within the company, so it operates separately from the rest of the company pretty much. But they also started integrating Skype within their other systems and services. They renamed Link, which was the corporate communication chat and video and VoIP software, and they renamed that literally. They renamed the Link.exe just to Skype for Business for the longest time. That's since changed since they've been able to re-architect Skype for Business from the ground up. But originally, the Link executable was just renamed to Skype for Business, which was kind of funny if you think about it, because you remember DOS back in the day? Originally renamed from 86-DOS to MS-DOS, but that doesn't make it any less effective. So I don't think I have to go in too much to tell you about the importance of Skype to the brand, especially the Skype for Business as Office 365 began to gain momentum. I think they were probably more worried about getting brand recognition for the Office 365 communication space, and that's one reason they acquired Skype, because Skype on the back end is actually a disaster. And is one thing that I may like to cover in a podcast going forward, but at the time, Skype is written in Delphi. Delphi is one of the most complex backends you could ever think for such a system, but it's also robust, and there's reasons they made those decisions. But if you ever feel yourself really bored and you want to go to sleep, just go Google or Bing the Skype backend systems and Delphi and all those sorts of things. And that, from a technological perspective, Skype didn't really make sense to Microsoft, because back then Microsoft was a very closed ecosystem. They are not the Microsoft of today. This was whenever they were trying to build everything on .NET, and in that regard, Skype just didn't fit in with the Delphi perspective. But I think it was a great acquisition for them. It's still a good brand to this day. Skype for Business is a behemoth, but even Skype for Business is kind of going away now. But I think for the acquisition for the time was probably good. All of the information, the analytics they got from it alone, I think probably paid dividends, especially once they started bundling with Windows desktops and that sort of thing. And so I don't think Skype was a bad acquisition. I think it was a brand acquisition more than it was a technology acquisition. I think they've had more headaches with the Skype technology than they've had successes. But that doesn't mean that it was a bad acquisition. And if there's anyone from the Skype team who wants to come on and talk about this and maybe even set me straight, I'm getting information second and third hand from people within the company, from what I've read from the company, from what I read about Skype before they came on and the original architecture. I'd love to talk about it, and we'd love to discuss it, and maybe you can shed some light on those growing pains once the Skype team was trying to integrate itself within Microsoft and the platforms and services available. So just an open invitation out there for anybody from the Skype team who'd like to discuss. Followed shortly after the Skype acquisition was Yammer. And Yammer is kind of an enigma to some people who aren't familiar with the enterprise space. But just think of Yammer as like a Facebook for the enterprise, where you can have communications between teams and groups and customers and those sorts of things. I think in the initial phases, Yammer was really great, but it can, like Facebook, become a time sink and cumbersome. I've seen Yammer used really, really well. I've seen Yammer used really, really bad. Whenever I was at Microsoft, I was there during the initial Xbox One announcements, whenever they made those announcements. If anybody remember those train wrecks with the DRM and the always on and that sort of thing. I was actually an admin on the Xbox Yammer group at the time, which was 60,000 people in that Yammer group. And Yammer is really powerful because you can at people, you can at literally. At the time, you could at Steve Ballmer. It's not recommended you do that, but you could, you can literally reach out to anyone within the organization at any time, and if they want to get involved with you, they can. And so Yammer is a very, very powerful tool. I think it's still a great tool for companies that need it. It's just at a huge scale that I don't think that it's a great for the medium and small businesses or even the smaller enterprises, but for global organizations, it can be really, really powerful. I don't know why I'm going down a rabbit hole for Yammer, but Yammer I think is still a good product, and I think is a good acquisition. I think maybe they might have overpaid for it a little bit, but some people could say, but they got it to add to their Office 365 repertoire, right? They were trying to differentiate themselves from the other platforms and enterprise cloud providers, and so Yammer was another tool in that toolbox. Yammer was acquired in 2012. It's still used by millions of people from all across the world in their corporations every single day. My current company does not use Yammer, but then we're only a company of about 1,500 people. Previously, I was at a global investment bank. We did use it because it was a global investment bank of about 15,000 people and people all over the world. They were using it just as well as whenever I was internally at Microsoft. And so there are companies out there using it, and that's great to know because it is a good tool set. All right, now we're pushing past Yammer into Nokia. 2013, Microsoft acquired Nokia and acquired many of its licenses, but not everything that Nokia owned. And that's why Nokia is still around to this day. Their licenses expired, and then Nokia is back to making phones and those sorts of things. I think we all can probably agree that Nokia was a clear last-ditch effort by the old guard, the Steven Sinofskys, the Steve Ballmers, trying to make Windows Phone relevant when it was already pretty much dead. The problem with adoption with the Windows Phone is because they changed the platform 3 times over about 5 years. Windows Phone 7 was a completely different architecture than Windows Phone 8, and Windows Phone 8 was a completely different architecture than Windows Phone 10. And so your older phones cannot be upgraded to the newer operating systems because the architecture was different, which sucked for early adopters. And the most passionate people for Windows phones are people like myself, the early adopters who had every single Windows Phone that came out. I think I have had 10 Windows phones and I still miss it to this day. But this Nokia acquisition was clearly for them trying to make a last-ditch effort within the mobile space. I think if you look back at all of their acquisitions, this is the one that sticks out as a sore thumb, as just a black eye on. It just didn't make sense. They were already partnered with Nokia. Nokia was already making partnered hardware for them. It was just really, really strange. And I know that they did a lot for the licensing, but then they didn't even license like all of their greatest technology, like the NavTech map technology that Nokia has. They didn't even license that. It's just one of the head scratchers. It's one of the real head scratchers during their acquisitions. It kind of surmised the panic that was post Windows 8, right? Windows 8 didn't succeed very well. The first couple of Surfaces didn't do very well, mainly because of the form factor, in my opinion. Then the dichotomy between Windows 8 RT and Windows 8, and then the Windows 8.1, and what's a desktop, what's not a desktop. It took them 4 or 5 years to get it right, but they finally got it right with Surface and Windows. But Windows Phone was a casualty during that, and it's mainly because they just couldn't get developer buy-in, and that was mainly because they kept switching the frickin' platform. I know, because I was trying to write apps on Windows 7 as I'm learning, and then I tried to reuse them on Windows 8, and then I tried to build them on Windows 10. Now it's just pretty much dead in the water, and I discussed this in the previous podcast, but I think Windows Phone will make a comeback, and Continuum, which is you plug your phone in and it becomes your desktop. I think that software is fantastic, and I think that's going to be around, but we have to have the hardware and the battery to make it last and make it stick. The Surface Phone will come one day, and we will all be blown away. At least I hope. Please, 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 God. I hoped for 10 years. I remember when Bill Gates displayed the first tablet at 2001 at Comdex, and I wanted a Windows tablet from that time. And I remember the original Surface, whenever I saw it, I fell in love. And then I used it. I traveled all the time, and I used it. Yeah, I even had the Surface RT. Then I got the Surface Pro. And I still love the device, but I completely understand why people did not love those early devices. I was able to manage just fine with the touch and between the touch interface or the desktop interface and all those sorts of things. But don't ever get me started on not having a start menu on a Windows server. Windows Server 2012 was a nightmare on a terminal whenever you couldn't hit Windows key. But I'm going down a rant again, but Nokia was clearly a play from the old guard within Microsoft they were going all in. They were throwing a Hail Mary and hoping it'd stick, and it just fell flat on its face. I think we can all agree that the Nokia hardware was great. Nokia hardware to this day is great. I think we can all agree that their hardware is great, but that's not what the problem was. The problem was the ecosystem, and the problem was they had to rush Windows Phone out. So Windows Phone was rushed, and so it was incomplete, which is why they had to upgrade the architecture for Windows 8, which was also incomplete. And so once they got the Windows 10, which is what they wanted all along, the ship had sailed. Android and iPhone were just too far ahead, and Windows 10 still wasn't ready for prime time when it come to phones and getting user adoption and the universal Windows platform and that sort of thing. So that just shot this 2013 acquisition of Nokia dead in the water. After the disaster that was Nokia, Microsoft in 2014 acquired Mojang, or the parent company of Minecraft, the hit video game, for $2.5 billion. And I remember even myself, whenever I heard that number, $2.5 billion, why were they buying a video game for that much money? But it all makes sense now, but back then it did not. Microsoft was lambasted for this by the press. I was just reading a Wired article regarding this. And I'm going to do an actual Minecraft episode within the near future, so stay tuned for that. But just know that Microsoft was lambasted for this decision. And this was actually a huge decision internally within the company. And it's turned out and paid huge dividends because Microsoft's playing the long game. They looked at Minecraft as an educational tool. And that's exactly what it is today. Not only is it a fun video game, but they've turned it into an educational tool, which helps with our Office 365 sales within education. Seeing that I'm going to make a long episode just on Minecraft and the importance of Minecraft and just why they ended up paying $2.5 billion for what counted to a video game, but there's now way more than that. Just know that this one has actually paid for itself 10 times over at this point. After 2014 and 2016 was their largest acquisition to date in the mid 20 billions, and that was LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is the professional network as we all know it, that we all probably have accounts on there, and it is the place to go for professional networking and job searches. Sure, Monster's still around and JobVite and all these other sites, but if you're not networking on LinkedIn, you're being left out. It's just a tremendous resource for just networking and being involved with people. From the business perspective, if you tell people you don't have a LinkedIn, it's kind of like saying you don't have a resume, I think, at this point. That gets us through the notable acquisitions that I really wanted to cover for the first part of this podcast. And like now we'll go down into what they've done in the last couple of years and how that's showing a more rapid movement and a more rapid succession, a more DevOps, if you will. I think it shows a clear direction into where they're going over the next several years within the corporation, within their platforms, within their technologies. So let's start out where we left off. Since they've acquired LinkedIn, they've actually expanded its reach and its usability and its tool sets by acquiring other companies. Connectifier was one, which is a machine learning technology that they purchased in 2016 that generates business leads. It's a lead generation software, but it's machine learning based. And they've tied that within and bundled that with LinkedIn packages and those sorts of things. In 2018, they acquired the leading e-learning platform, lynda.com, to kickstart their LinkedIn Learning initiative. With LinkedIn Learning, you can go learn from e-learning solutions, and then once you complete those courses, you can add those certificates of completion directly to your profile. And so it's just a way for them to integrate training with hiring, right? And then those sorts of things. And that ties into other solutions that they have as well, including Glint. Glint, which is also could be tied into the LinkedIn Learning, is an employee improvement and engagement platform. So if you have employees who want to go through education, or if you have employees who are struggling, or if you have employees who are leaving and you're trying to figure those sorts of things out and you want to maintain retention and those things, that's the Glint platform. And so with Connectifier, Lynda, and Glint since 2016, they've been targeting acquisitions that were specifically strengthening the LinkedIn brand and platform. While Office 365 is the industry leader in the enterprise and businesses, in the education system, it's been kind of struggling. And so in an effort to keep up with Google and to challenge Google in that space, Microsoft has been looking for ways to bolster the 365 platform specifically for educational uses. In comes the 2018 acquisition of Flipgrid. Flipgrid is an educational and collaboration video platform built around collaborating and team building and having interactive education experiences within the classroom. It's like an educational social network where, if I had to explain it as simply as possible, I'd say take LinkedIn, take like Microsoft Teams, and take like Snapchat, put all those together, and you have something that kids and teachers and educators could use to create an entertaining and engaging education platform for our technology-addicted and short attention span generations. Whenever Flipgrid was acquired, they were charging $1,000 per school for the platform. So each school had to pay $1,000. They could have all their students in there doing video and team collaboration and all sorts of things. But immediately upon the announcement, Microsoft removed all costs associated with Flipgrid with the rest of their education software and initiatives like Office 365 and OneNote. Not only that, it's also extended past, the primary schools and junior highs and high schools. Anyone who has an education system or anyone who's taking training or something like that can create their own grids for that training. Spoiler alert, we're actually making one for this podcast to hopefully help get people some training in the future that's going to be integrated with our website. More to come on that, but just know that Flipgrid was initially purchased and acquired to add another tool in the educational tool belt for Microsoft and Office 365 and other technologies fighting for attention within the educational space. Next up, we have GitHub, which I'm sure you've all heard. GitHub was a software repository and known for its open source usability and known for just being loved by open source advocates all across the world. And whenever Microsoft purchased it, people all over the world cried that Microsoft is going to ruin it. This big money-grabbing company is going to take it and charge more and ruin what it is and all those other sorts of things. Instead, Microsoft has flipped that notion on its head, and they've published many of their applications and services and platforms and made them open source and put them on GitHub themselves. They've moved their repos to GitHub itself. They've completely bought into the Git repo system, and they wanted to be at the forefront of that, and they wanted to enable developers to succeed in this world. And Microsoft, again, today just announced that they've taken a premium product that they acquired and they're making it free. They're not making all of GitHub free, but before, if you had private repositories, so you had your private code and your private software, you had to pay, I think it was $7.95 a month or something like that for the private. Now they're giving everyone, every account, access to at least a few private repos themselves. So it is a free service now for a lot of people. And so now we're going to take a quick look back with this interview with CEO Satya Nadella on the day they acquired GitHub on CNBC and see how it's kind of played out since that acquisition time. They made their acquisition in October 2018, and as I said, the world nearly lost its mind. But Satya Nadella lays out in this interview why they think it was an important acquisition and why it was important not just for Microsoft, but for technology as a whole going forward.
So this is a big deal, particularly in Microsoft's traditional approach to developers. Tell me, I mean, you don't buy GitHub to make a lot of money. So lay out, if you will, the strategic benefit of GitHub for Microsoft. How closely do you have to tie it in to things like Azure, and where do you keep it arm's length in order to try to maintain that sort of open source, neutral rapport with the developer community?
Yeah, the first thing, John, is when you think about what's happening in the broader world, every business is a software business, it's a digital business, whether it's precision medicine or precision agriculture, personalized education or personalized banking, is being built by developers. In fact, there's a piece of data from LinkedIn which says that non-tech hiring of software development is growing steadily at double digit, 25% greater than software engineer growth in tech. So that speaks to the world that's going to be there going forward. From a secular basis, developers are going to be required everywhere. It's kind of like what maybe in the early 90s was to equip knowledge workers with tools and services, or what it was even in the 2000s to build SaaS services for sales professionals. Developer SaaS is going to be at the center of the digital economy, and that's the real strategic rationale for it. It's a secular growth market, and Microsoft has heritage here. We were a developer tools company first, and now, of course, we are all in on open source, and that's what really brings us together with GitHub. And we're going to operate it as an open platform for any language, any framework, any platform, whether it's the cloud or on the client, and really serve the developers with a SaaS service that everyone requires, just like we do for knowledge workers with Office 365 or business applications with Dynamics.
So basically what Satya is saying is what we've kind of been saying on this podcast since the inception. We've entered into an agile world where people need to be able to pivot and be able to adapt, and people need to be able to move between teams. And so like he's saying, developers aren't only going to be in IT departments from now on. Developers are going to be in every single department. Like me, I work in construction management. Like, that's my department, but that's not what I do. I'm not part of the IT department. I work and do things with Microsoft Flow and Power BI and Power Apps and systems integration and SharePoint and all these other things, but I'm not part of the IT team. And that's just because the business has grown to that. And our company is only about 1,500 people. It's kind of fitting that, basically GitHub is a social network for developers. It truly is, because you can share and you can comment and you can help and you can do all these other sorts of things. And that's what he's saying, is he wants to be able to provide a platform for all developers of all skill levels where they can go and look at and contribute and do all these other sorts of things. And that's what GitHub is. And that's the future. And that's the reason they acquired it. To finish off the discussion on their recent acquisitions, Microsoft over the last several years has bought AI and machine learning technologies and companies and solutions. That includes a conversational AI company called XOXOCO, and a visual AI service called Lobe, an industrial AI platform called Bonsai, a conversational AI technology from Semantic Machines, and AI from Maluba. And so that's within this last 2 years. That's a handful of AI and machine learning solutions they've bought. We discussed this with the automation podcast from last week. It's the future, right? I mean, they're investing heavily in that future. Moving on from there, they've also invested heavily in game studios, especially over the summer whenever they made a huge announcement with several game studios. But in the last several years, they've acquired Obsidian Entertainment, InXile Entertainment, Playground Games, Compulsion Games, Undead Labs, and Ninja Theory. Not only that, but they've also acquired Beam, which is now Mixer, so it's a competitor to Twitch.tv, but it's a streaming service, and you can stream your video games directly from your phone or your PC or your Xbox. And they also acquired Simplygon, which is a 3D graphics optimization company, AltSpace VR, which is a virtual reality company, and PlayFab, which is a gaming back-end service. So I think it is clear from their acquisitions, their recent acquisitions over the last 2 or 3 years, that what they're saying is what they're doing. They're focusing on AI, they're focusing on machine learning and automation, they're keeping a focus on the developer, and then they're making acquisitions that strengthen their brands and services that they already have. And so I want to play one more clip. This is from Dr. Eric Horvitz, a technical fellow and Microsoft researcher, where he talks about how you take two decent ideas and you put them together to make one great idea. And you can see that that's kind of an internal mantra, not only in Microsoft Research, but at Microsoft. And that's what a lot of these acquisitions are doing. They're taking a pretty good or great product and they're adding it to their pretty good product. You're just taking that product and service to the upper echelon when you bundle those together. So here's Dr. Eric Horvitz.
For me, I've always been the kind of person that never got to the end of my whys. Why this, why that, but why? But that doesn't answer my question. Why would that be the case? And I've noticed that I got a lot of pleasure out of that. My mind is driven to ask questions. And when I come to an answer that I didn't expect, I get such a burst of pleasure. So it's just the way I live. I'm in the exact right spot for having a joyful experience creating. I think one of the deepest values at Microsoft Research and at other labs is creativity, creation, coming up with new ideas that have never been thought of before, combining two sort of well-known ideas into a whole new innovative combination that leads to a whole new concept. If doing that also brings up answers to whys, it's fabulous to learn more as you go. Being in a research lab puts you in a world where you're on a lifelong learning, crashing wave of lifelong learning. You're always kind of surfing this wave of the unknown.
So I want to play that clip from Dr. Horvitz on the Microsoft Research podcast for two reasons. First, he talks about how, again, you take two pretty good things or two good things and put them together and make a really special thing. And I think that's what acquisitions can let you do. And Microsoft's really been able to do that with acquisitions in the past. But also, like the last part where he's talking about he's always searching for his whys, that's a huge reason that I've decided to make this podcast and decided to go down this journey. Because as Satya alluded to in his previous interview within this podcast, we're going to need to continue to evolve and change rapidly with it. That DevOps lifestyle is going to be an ops lifestyle. Like, you're going to have to be able to adapt and keep learning. And that's the goal of this podcast. And that's the goal of the message I kind of wanted to get across here with these acquisitions. Microsoft's always trying to improve, and they know they don't have all the right answers. They know that the quickest point to improving sometimes is through acquisitions. They don't always work, like Nokia, but they can help and they can work. And I know Microsoft's not the only company that makes big acquisitions that changes and revolutionizes their products, but this is a Microsoft podcast, so I'm focusing on the Microsoft-related ones. But I do think technology companies can have acquisitions that completely change the trajectory of that company, and Microsoft certainly had some of those. With that said, I think the conclusion is pretty clear, at least for me. Microsoft sees the world heading to a developer-centric organism, where developers no longer exist in the bubble of technology, but they live and work and breathe across all aspects of society, including education. They also know as technologies continue to evolve, we, the people, and the companies we work for will struggle to keep pace with the rapid change. In an effort to build lead market and to prepare us all, they are focusing on acquisitions to bolster their already strong products rather than reinventing the wheel. They just add the newer and better wheels to their already fine-tuned machine. And they continue to tell us what Steve Ballmer's been telling us all along.
Developers, 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 developers.
Sorry I had to throw that in there, Steve. I'm sure you're listening. All joking aside, Microsoft's always been developer-centric. They've never really stopped being developer-centric, but now they're for all developers, not just Microsoft developers, and that's the key difference. And with that, we covered the original history of Microsoft acquisitions and then recent history of Microsoft acquisitions and how it all fits and molds into the company they are now and the company they want to be in the future for our world and for our ever-evolving world. I, for one, am thankful that they have not only gotten the acquisitions right, but those acquisitions have strengthened and improved their company to lead us all into the future. And as I close, I just want to thank everyone again who supported Microsoft Today so far and who hopefully will support us in the future. I challenge all of you to let one person know about Microsoft Today that you think would enjoy it. Coworker, a family member, or a friend. Please help spread Microsoft Today and share the podcast with them. And if you feel it in your heart, please head to patreon.com/MSFT Today and think about backing us on Patreon. With that said, our next podcast is in just 2 days. January 10th on Thursday, we'll have another podcast. Again, we drop every Tuesday, every Thursday on your favorite podcasting platform. So look for that. Hit us up on Twitter if you have any show ideas. We do have some major interviews from actual Microsoft employees and actual Microsoft teams coming soon. And I just want to let you know, if you hang out after my little call to action, I have a little gift for you after that. So don't hang up yet. You're not going to want to miss the closing song. Until next time, people, spiral out. Keep going. Finally, Microsoft fans, I'm here to call you to action. For too long, we've been inundated and attacked with misinformed, misguided, and ignorant news and coverage about Microsoft. Well, to that, I say no more. With your help, we can defeat the ignorant and lift up the technologically oppressed by spreading the word about Microsoft, their products, and their people the right way. So I challenge you today to stand up for the technologically oppressed and help spread the word about Microsoft Today. Subscribe to this podcast and share it with your family, friends, and colleagues. Write a 5-star review on iTunes, support it on Patreon, and follow Microsoft Today on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I can't do this alone, but with your help and God willing, we can come together to defeat the tyranny of misinformation. Until next time, Microsoft fans, good luck on the battlefield in your fight against ignorance, and Godspeed.
Developers.